Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The California State Legislature will soon receive California's task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The commission spent 2 years investigating and analyzing racial gaps in health, wealth, housing, education, and employment that affect Black Californians. Some of the task force's recommendations include investing in Black communities, Black businesses, education, police reform, and other such things. It also includes a recommendation for direct cash payments to Black Californians that reportedly could be potentially as high as $1.2 million for each person. Some of these recommendations could be turned into bills as early as the end of the month. Governor Gavin Newsom, who supported creating the commission, said in a recent statement that, quote, dealing with that legacy is about much more than cash payments. Don't know exactly what that means. However, he has yet to endorse or even oppose any of the recommendations. He says he will wait until the report is officially handed to the state legislature. The direct cash payment, again, which is just one of many proposals, could cost the state some $800 billion. Well, today we're going to be in conversation about reparations, its history, what's happening right now, and its future. My guest for this is William A. Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. William A. Darity Jr. is a Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, and Economics, and founding director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. And A. Kirsten Mullen is an independent scholar. She's also a folklorist and founder of Artefactual, which is an art consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. Together, they are both contributors and editors of the book called The Black Reparations Project, a handbook for racial justice. It is a product of the Black Reparations Project, which represents the collective work of the Reparations Planning Committee, which is a group of about 20 scholars. Kirsten Mullen and William Darity, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you both to this program.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
I should say right from the beginning, you've worked as consultants to this California Commission that has studied for reparations. So we'll see if that puts you in a funny spot in talking about it. But what the thing that stands out to people is $1.2 million cash payments to individuals. Should that be seen as high, or should that be seen as about right?
Let me say first, we're pro bono consultants to the California Department of Justice and to the Reparations Task Force. I think the question should probably be different, not whether or not $1.2 million is high or low, but does the state of California have the capacity to pay a reparations bill of that size? For us, the culpable and the capable party for paying reparations to Black Americans since the U.S. slavery is the federal government. We don't believe that states and municipalities should be taxed, should be on the hook for these payments. They can't afford to pay them. Their budgets are too small. And, we also believe that the federal government is the responsible party and that they should pay the bill, not states and municipalities.
Yeah, the total budget, I think, for the state of California is in the vicinity of $300 billion. The amounts that we have seen put forward as overall calculations of what might be paid on the basis of the tentative report that the task force has put forward have ranged from $200 billion to $800 billion. I've seen folks say that it would be feasible for the state to pay it if it did so over a long period of time. I've even seen the organization called Liberation Ventures propose that it might be 50 years. And they talk about a $500 billion figure. But if you were to distribute that equally in real dollars over a 50-year period, you're talking about a $10 billion expenditure per annum. And that would mean very, very small payments to individuals on an annual basis. I don't think they would be transformative. So it's just very, very difficult for states and localities to meet an expense of this type. I think that the calculation of the total budgets for all state and local governments in the United States and that's 108,000 towns and cities,
Right.
maybe, and 50 states, comes to less than $5 trillion. And our focus is on an objective of eliminating the racial wealth gap in the United States. And we can talk a bit more about why that's our focus. But we estimate that would require at least $14 trillion in expenditure. And so there's just absolutely no way in which the states and local governments could meet that bill.
Do you feel the states and local governments, because there's other local governments that are also exploring reparations, do you feel as though that takes away from the push of getting the federal government to do reparations, or maybe the federal government?
That's our view. When we don't know for a fact, but we can imagine a scenario in which people would say, opponents of reparations would say, well, you've got this project in California, you've got this project in Illinois, you had the housing voucher program in Evanston. You don't need a national program. But as Sandy said, there are over 108,000 cities in the United States. Are all of them going to enact some kind of reparations program? And already, when you're looking at the 24 or so programs that are in motion, they're not identical. What they're calling reparations varies greatly. Some of them are talking about, as I mentioned, Evanston, Illinois, a housing voucher program that is masquerading as reparations. Some of them are suggesting that funds be set aside to assist with the identification of historic structures that have significance for Black people. They vary tremendously in terms of what their goals are and who they even target. Asheville, North Carolina, for example, has a reparations project that focuses on minorities, not Black American descendants of U.S. slavery at all, not specifically. So, we just don't feel that these projects are adequate in terms of their scope, and they absolutely are inadequate in terms of their budget because they're not designed. I don't know of a single one that's designed to eliminate the racial wealth gap, which for us is really essential to true reparations.
There's a host of things that states and localities can do to make conditions better, but we don't think that they can collectively or individually do enough to meet the demands of elimination of the racial wealth gap in the United States. And insofar as that's the case, we wish they would not call these types of initiatives reparations. We'd be perfectly content if they said they were undertaking something that you might label a racial equity initiative. But there's a certain presumptuousness associated with the use of the term reparations because of its moral significance and because of its historic significance in terms of the record of the United States of America. And so we wish that these piecemeal initiatives at the state and local level, and even individual private actors, would not claim that what they're doing is reparations.
When you say private actors, do you mean sort of corporations that were involved in slavery?
Corporations or even individuals,
or colleges and universities or churches,
cultural institutions?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're not against them doing certain actions; just you're against them calling it reparations. Is that right?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an important point. What is reparations? When we have the national dialogue over reparations, we talk about it in many ways. And in one way we talk about it is, well, reparations should be greater investment in Black communities and education. And actually many of these recommendations that the commission in California came up with. But what for you is reparations?
We're talking about acknowledgement, redress and closure, for a grievous injustice. For conveniently, it creates the acronym ARC, A-R-C. So we're talking about, in terms of acknowledgement, this is referring to the perpetrators of the harms or the atrocities admitting that they were the culpable parties, right? And
is that an apology?
It would be an apology.
Although, we have had apologies already. But we've not had apologies that were coupled with an admission of responsibility.
It's the declaration of responsibility
that's huge.
That's crucial.
And so this is where the restitution, would come in. But so redress, is that formal act of restitution. Historically, members of victimized communities have been awarded monetary, prizes, monetary grants for those harms, and we don't think that should be any different today. This was certainly the case when the Holocaust victims were granted reparations. This was the case when Japanese Americans were granted reparations for their unlawful internment in the United States. And so we don't think it should be any different in the United States. It shouldn't be any different. Let me start that again. We know that, reparations were paid to, victims of the Holocaust. And they continue to be paid, actually, not only by Germany, but by the U.S. government, even though the U.S. government was not a perpetrator of those harms.
The United States pays in Holocaust reparations? I didn't know that.
That is correct. And in fact, they were increased during the period of COVID.
To victims and
to their
descendants who are U.S. citizens.
So many people are aware that the United States also, has contributed to those payments. But also, the United States government's paid reparations to Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned in the United States. Many people aren't aware that the U.S. government is also paying reparations to Americans who were held hostage in Tehran, Iran in 1979-80. And those, 52 hostages are receiving reparations from the U.S. government of $10,000 per day of captivity. So that's about $4.4 million each. So we definitely have a precedent for it. People just begin to balk and drag their feet when the potential recipients of payments for atrocities and harms committed against them are Black Americans of U.S. slavery. So then lastly, closure, means that the culpable party and the party that was subjected to these atrocities and harms would agree that the terms for redress have been met. And the idea then would be that the victimized party would not bring any additional claims to the federal government, to the U.S. government, unless there is a renewal of some of the old harms or new ones are inflicted upon them.
A lot there I want to unpack. Let me begin with the apology. The United States has apologized for slavery,
right,
but without the other part.
Yes, they're very careful not to acknowledge, responsibility for, Sandy mentioned, nearly 100 years of massacres that were directed at, Black people between Reconstruction and the end of World War II, that resulted not only in the loss of Black lives, but the appropriation of Black people's property, which further increases the racial wealth gap.
The United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate have issued apologies for slavery, but the Senate apology is specific in saying that this is not a commitment to provide any form of restitution, and correspondingly, there is no statement of responsibility for the history of atrocities on the part of the United States government in either apology. So, and given the fact that it's United States law that made slavery legal, it's United States law that made segregation legal for close to a century. It's United States law that introduced the Homestead Act of 1862 that gave 160 acres of land to 1.5 million white American families in the latter part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century. 160-acre land grants where the social scientist Trina Williams Shanks estimates that there are now 45 million living white Americans who continue to be beneficiaries of these land patents that were received. And at the same time, the federal government reneged on its commitment to provide 40-acre land grants to the newly emancipated. And so we argue that that's the beginning of the contemporary racial wealth divide between blacks and whites, the fact that the federal government gave a substantial asset in the form of land to a large number of white Americans. In fact, we estimate that somewhere in the vicinity of 10 to 12% of the white population in the United States received these land patents from the federal government.
That was like 1.5 million white households.
Yeah.
At the time.
And then on the other hand, I think the upper bound estimate of the total number of Black Americans, not families, but individuals who had access to some form of land patent from the federal government amounted to about 20,000 people. And that's out of 4 million individuals who were newly emancipated at the end of the Civil War. So less than 1%.
Right. Yeah, this Olmsted, comparing it, reparations and the 40 acres to the Olmsted Act is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that,
because the Olmsted Act happened
evidently,
right?
I certainly was not taught, I was not introduced to those two things, those two federal policies side by side in high school or college classes. And yet, they're right there together. 1862 was the Homestead Act, and you've got emancipation at 1865. So, I think I and many others would have had a very different kind of lens to examine all of this if we had understood those two policies, those two federal policies, pretty coexisted, and what the implications of those policies, is today. I mean, approximately 45 million white individuals are benefiting from that single government policy today. The last land patent was made in 1980. So, that legislation carried for over a century. I mean, it's just extraordinary. In one data point, this is our colleague, Jennifer Mueller.
It's pretty dramatic data point.
Yeah. Asked her students at Texas A&M University to, interrogate their family's wealth position, find out where did the money come from in your family. And I think many of the students had a story of, this individual or that individual who was, incredibly persevering or, had some innovation or a patent, someone who, put in a lot of sweat equity. And that's where the money came from. And while, we don't doubt that that was the case, we would also say people, do some research and find out exactly, when and how the federal government intervened on your family's behalf. So, in fact, fully 25% of her students, about 150 students, found evidence of a land grant. And then an even higher percentage, closer to over 80% of them had evidence of GI bills, which and in some cases more than one in a single
GI bill
benefits to buy a house. In many cases, they had more than one individual, across their family who had been able to purchase a home as a consequence of support from the federal government. And zero non-white students had a Homestead Act patent in her class. Well, but the example I was going to share was one student whose family had been given land in the Panhandle of Texas. That's that sort of rectangle at the top. It was 26 counties in 1880. And this is land that you could live on the land, you could subdivide the land, you could lease it, you could borrow against it. But any of the natural resources on the land were yours to use, to sell. Any woodlands could be planed as lumber, any wildlife, water rights, mineral rights, etc. They decided that they would lease the land So immediately they're receiving a revenue stream from this homestead property.
Yeah.
All right. So sometime later, the patriarch dies, and his widow decides to move with their 8 children to Austin, Texas, to give the children a better opportunity of going to college. So they moved to Austin. 6 of the 8 receive college degrees, debt-free, because they can afford to pay for college. Then the matriarch dies, and the 8 children decide to continue to lease the land and split the profits 8 ways. So moving forward to 1980, they still own the land, and natural gas is discovered on the property. And the deposits are so rich that in the first year alone, the profits were over $100,000. So you have this example of this, this individual family basically receiving, free equity from the federal government. I mean, it's a handout. It's a free handout from the federal government. We're not against handouts, but we just think that they should be equitably dispersed. And so this opportunity to have an asset that was provided by the federal government is something that white Americans have and that Black Americans did not get. Never mind that the Black newly emancipated people were promised 40 acres versus 160, but they didn't get the 40. They didn't have this opportunity to accumulate wealth over generations. And we know that's how wealth, is created. It's not just, what an individual can amass in their lifetime. It's what did your parents, what did your grandparents or great-grandparents amass, and what did they pass down to you?
I'd like to go back to Kirsten's comment about the GI Bill.
Yeah, interesting link, right, from Homestead to GI Bill, because GI Bill is also during a time of redlining.
Right. So you go from, helping white people become, middle class and upper class with land acquisition, and then we switch to the acquisition of a home. But,
that's the big shift. The federal government's asset building program in the 19th century involved land distribution as it completed its colonial settler project in the Western Territories. But in the 20th century, its asset building focus shifted to home ownership. But, as Kirsten suggested, that was conducted in a highly discriminatory fashion. Initially, under the auspices of the New Deal, you had the introduction of the Federal Housing Administration, and it's the Federal Housing Administration in a public-private partnership with local banks that conducted the redlining scheme, which essentially starved Black potential homeowners from credit. And then the GI Bill is introduced as a means of providing support to returning veterans after World War II. And the home buying provisions were executed in a highly discriminatory fashion so that you built a middle class in the United States dramatically from that piece of legislation, but you built a middle class that was, white middle class in the United States. And so again, you could think about this as another type of handout, if you will.
Yeah.
But
Ira Katz-Nelson, sociologist, calls it affirmative action for white people.
Yeah.
He looks at Mississippi specifically, and
with the New Deal, right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Since 1949, something like 3,900 benefits were made for white GIs. Were made for GIs in the state, a little over 3,900. Two out of nearly 4,000 went to Black GIs in the entire state. So, it wasn't even, it's not even, it's not even close. The kinds of benefits, opportunities that were made available for Black people.
And the Northern story is not all that much better, right?
The numbers are much higher. Closer to 100,000 white GIs in 1949, but the number of non-white GIs is closer to 1,000. So you're still talking about 1% or less than 1%. Actually, it's less than that in Mississippi.
Yeah.
So
this is Letters in Politics, and
it's like a percentage of 1% in Mississippi.
It's negligible in Mississippi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me let everyone know who we're talking to. This is Letters in Politics, and today we are in conversation with William Darity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen. Together, they are both editors and contributors to a book called The Black Reparations Project, a handbook for racial justice. Let me dive in history now and ask about the promise of 40 acres. Oftentimes we hear it as 40 acres and a mule. I'll let you clarify if that's what it actually was. Where does this promise come from?
So this is part of General William Sherman's Special Field Order number 15. The mule, which is not specified in the order, but referred to, a farming animal. In fact, what was discussed in the correspondence, in federal correspondence, was seeds, tools, but they are not specified in the field order itself. So this was land that had been formerly owned by the Confederates. You're talking about a 30-mile swath of land that stretched from the Sea Islands of South Carolina all the way across to the St. Johns River in Florida. This is land that would have been, occupied, exclusively by Black people. So this would have been the moment when, Black people would have had, an opportunity to become full citizens in the United States. If they had been protected by, allowed to have these 40-acre landers, and then it was like a maximum of 40 acres. Everyone probably would not have received the full 40 acres.
Well, the Homestead Act said a maximum of 160. So it was kind of implicitly understood that you'd get that amount.
But that was not necessarily the case.
Well, no. Under Sherman's order.
Yes.
The initial allocation that was made was 400,000 acres to 40,000 individuals, which is 10 acres per person. And if you think about 40. A family being approximately four people,
that's how the 40 acres.
They were getting 40 acres, but the total amount of land that was designated under Special Field Orders number 15 higher. Was 5.3 million acres.
Yeah, it's substantial.
So it was only 400,000 acres that were allocated before Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor after Lincoln was murdered. It was only 400,000 acres that had been allocated before Andrew Johnson reneged on the program and stopped it.
And then the land reverts back to the ex-Confederates who had owned it, previously.
Yeah.
It's interesting, as Sandy mentioned a bit earlier, the land that, the white homesteaders were given was in the Western Territories. So this is land that had just only recently been inhabited by, Native Americans. So this helped the nation, complete its colonial settler project.
Right.
Yeah, but in contrast,
we're talking about land that had been confiscated from or abandoned by the Confederates,
the traders.
The traders of the United States.
Yeah,
much more palatable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so General Sherman comes up with this order. Of course, he's not a legislator. He's not a senator. He's not a representative. He's not in the executive the executive branch of government.
No, but he was following Lincoln's orders.
Oh, he was. So this came from Lincoln, inevitably.
Yes. Oh. And in fact, the federal government already had in place several experimental projects with Black people living on land that had been confiscated. One of those was in Port Royal, South Carolina. And as early as 1861, while the Civil War was being fought, Black people were settled on those lands, and they were producing, cotton, rice, indigo, and selling their goods to the federal government for fixed prices. And the research on those experiments reveals that they were wildly successful. I mean, clearly Black people knew something about farming. They'd been at it for a while. And they knew something about the special crops that had been introduced widely across the South. These projects were profitable, and the communities were thriving. So they knew that the experiment could work. The question was, will the federal government provide this land, provide this asset to these Black people as payment for hundreds of years of uncompensated labor?
And nobody ever got anything. Johnson going back on the deal occurred before
a few
anyone.
people did initially, but they were, for the most part, made to give the land back. And in some cases, people had, if they had managed to accumulate some savings and purchased seed or purchased agricultural implements or farm animals, they lost all of that. The federal government did not reimburse them for any expenses they had incurred.
Yeah, well, as we said a little bit earlier, that the total number of Black Americans who receive land grants from the federal government, the maximum estimate is approximately 20,000 persons. And that's a combination of individuals who got land grants under the Southern Homestead Act, which succeeded the Homestead Act of 1862. Not a replacement, but a complement to it. But it only lasted less than a decade, 6 or 7 years. And then there were some Black Americans who received land under the Homestead Act of 1862, primarily in Kansas. These are the individuals we refer to as the exodusters. So if you combine the folks who got land under the Southern Homestead Act with those who got some land under the Homestead Act, you get approximately 20,000 people at the upper bound. And as we pointed out, that's 20,000 persons
Out
when
of
the total number of persons who were
million.
emancipated were 4 million. Yeah.
Would there be a movement for reparations after this, in the early years after Johnson reneged on the promise?
Absolutely. I mean, we, understand that Black people, enslaved Black people were the original abolitionists. They were continuously trying to figure out how to liberate themselves, how to get paid for the labor they were forced to execute. But you had, formal organized efforts very early as well. One of those was through Callie House, who had been an enslaved person. She was in Tennessee, and, woman did not have formal education, but she had attended one of the freedom schools. And, one of the documents that they taught was, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And she, understood that to mean that the federal government exists to help the citizens. And her thinking was, if white veterans are receiving pensions from the federal government for their time serving in the Union, why not Black veterans? And so she began organizing the mutual beneficent group that she co-organizes. Eventually has a paid membership of over 300,000 individuals, probably more. That was the number that the federal government was aware of. And they began to, organize and to write letters and to have rallies. And then she was expanding, saying, the federal government should pay pensions to Black people, the older Black people who had been enslaved. So, yes, she was very focused on this very early. So this would have been like the 1890s. And but, even though they also provided sort of sickness benefits and funeral benefits. So, it's kind of the early insurance company model, basically. And that was very appealing.
But on a cooperative basis.
Right. I mean, people who would pay in, only people who paid in were eligible to receive support. But yeah, she was very, very driven, woman of high integrity. But the U.S. government was, what's the right word? Furious, incensed.
Hostile.
That hostile. How dare she suggests that the federal government owed these enslaved people anything. And then further, they said, anyone who would suggest that the federal government would pay a pension to the Black men and women who had served, or to the estates of those who had died, was a charlatan. And that she and any of her acolytes must be con artists. And so they went after her on that basis, and eventually convicted her on mail fraud. But although they were never able. There's a fabulous book that you may have seen, written by Mary Frances Berry, and it's a biography of Callie House. My Face is Black is True, and it's an astonishing account of her life. But she never promised that these things would be, that the federal government would pay a pension, the federal government would pay its debt to Black people. She was very clear, saying this is something we are asking for, something we are hoping for. We're making an appeal. At one point, she had proposed that the cotton that had been bales of cotton that had been confiscated from the Confederates during the war, but that was still being warehoused by United States Marshals, that the value of that cotton should be the basis of reparations. But the U.S. government, said, how dare you, try to claim a right to that cotton, that enslaved Black people grew, harvested, and baled. But yes, it was quite, she actually ended up going to jail for 1 year. She served a year in prison for her efforts. But the movement did not die with her.
The Marcus
chapters,
Garvey movement took it up, didn't it?
Chapters flourished across the country. Then the next person of note is Marcus Garvey, who has a similar model. Now, Garvey, though, was also proposing that, Black people's best bet was to relocate to the continent of Africa, which is not part of Callie House's agenda at all. Yeah. But he, too, is eventually targeted by the United States government for mail fraud, and was given the choice of going to jail or being deported back to Jamaica. And so he chooses deportation. But then you had, Audley Moore, who was a Garveyite. She's born in 1898 and becomes kind of like the modern face of reparations in the United States in the 20th century.
She's also known as Queen Mother Moore?
Queen Mother Audley Moore.
Yeah. Kirsten did a fabulous article about Queen Mother Audley Moore, what is called The Queen Mother.
The Queen Mother, yeah.
In Vanity Fair, November 2022. So very recent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, fascinating woman, Black nationalist, reparations advocate. And she was not only influential, but, understood the connection between the oppression of Black people in the South in terms of wages, in terms of policing. She was very much engaged, as was Ida B. Wells, in looking at the so-called lynching claims of white women against young black men across the South. These rape charges that white women were making against young black men, and linking them to the lynching trail across the South. But she was also interested in, looking at the paucity of jobs with any kind of growth potential for Black people in the South, but also in the North. But yeah, she was a very interesting character. She was active in Louisiana, and very much active in the state of New York.
And then
she was a Pan-Africanist, but her focus in terms of the reparations claim was specific to Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. That's who key. She felt were supposed to receive redress from the United States government.
In talking about reparations, and I thought you made a very important point earlier, that reparations is not something that's new to the United States or even to governments around the world. They happen all the time. The United States have paid reparations, as you mentioned, to Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, as they should have been. I think most people would agree that they should have been paid reparations.
Yeah, absolutely.
When ideas of reparations come up, and I saw this especially here in California when it was first reported about this commission's draft proposals that haven't been officially released yet. I did see a lot of people say we can't have reparations without also having reparations for Californian Indians, for Native Californians. Because if you look at the history of the state of California, they lost as much as anyone had lost, and also had a genocide conducted against them. How do you respond to the calls that if we're going to that there should be reparations for African Americans, there should also be reparations for Native Americans?
There's absolutely a very strong case for Native Americans, not just in California, but across the United States. And we support those efforts, but that is not the case we're making. We are focused very narrowly on the case for true reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I think there's a lot to be learned, in the two movements, and it's important to, come together and talk about strategy, and to talk about research methods. But the cases are different. And we think there's some danger involved in lumping them together, kind of log rolling or piggybacking. What we have seen when that kind of strategy is adopted is that both cases are diluted. It's really difficult, I think, for individuals to wrap their brains around the details of both cases. And so, focusing on one and, giving your support to the other, we think is a more effective way to proceed.
I think people are having a hard enough time trying to understand or appreciate the notion that reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is not a case that's being made exclusively on the basis of slavery.
Right.
In fact, there is a whole historical record in the post-slavery period of atrocities that forge the racial wealth differential in this country that are critical to the case for African American reparations. So then if you take the next step, which is to say, well, we're not only concerned about reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, but for this group and that group and so forth, it really, really distorts the argument. And I'll note that, when other communities have received reparations in the United States, including the Japanese American community, there was no significant overture towards saying, well, shouldn't Black Americans get reparations at the same time? And we don't think that overture should have been made, because it would have reduced the integrity of the distinct case or claim for reparations that the Japanese American community had.
So you're saying reparations
don't do that to us either.
Reparations have to be. You're saying reparations have to be focused.
Yes, absolutely.
Very specific community of eligibility.
Yeah.
I don't know if Sandy mentioned this too a little bit earlier, but for us, when we're thinking about Native Americans and reparations, you're talking about a case that involves sovereignty, which is very different from what Black American descendants of U.S. slavery are seeking. In this instance, we're talking about full citizenship rights, which is very different from a sovereignty claim. So that's another distinction.
Yeah,
I think that is really important. The material conditions for
full citizenship,
for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So there are not just nuances, but some huge differences, I think, that really come into play that get kind of diluted or just completely ignored when you lump these different groups together.
William Darity, you are an economist, and I had read for 30 years. You were influenced by a book that you read 30 years ago called The Wealth of Races, that ever since you have been trying to calculate how much, what reparations should be for Black Americans?
Yes. There's an article that Kirsten and I did with Marvin Slaughter that was published last year called The Cumulative Cost of Racism and the Bill for Reparations, where we attempted to do a critical analysis of various ways in which you might calculate the sum that is due as redress to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. I think that there are two fundamental approaches. One approach is to list, catalog, and enumerate all of the relevant harms and atrocities that have been imposed on a victimized community, find a way to assign a dollar value to each of those atrocities, and then add it up to come up with a total bill for the account. That's one approach, the enumeration approach, which is essentially what the California Reparations Task Force has settled on as the way in which they're attempting to address the recommendations that they're going to make. The second approach, though, is to try to find some single measure or indicator that captures essentially the combined effects of these atrocities in the present moment. And we've gravitated toward the latter because we think that there's insufficient information to actually do the enumeration effectively. We also think that many of the items that are placed on the list might not be relevant to the reparations claim that might be made by persons who are living today. So, for example, we have some excellent attempts at calculation of the cost of slavery to the persons who were enslaved. And the numbers get to be extraordinarily high.
Right.
Ranging from $54 trillion to $6 quadrillion. For the time that was stolen from all of the individuals who were subjected to slavery in the United States. But we don't think that is a bill that can be justifiably paid to those of us who are living descendants of the persons who were enslaved. And so what we need is a measure of the denied opportunities and economic security that confronts the folks who are living now as a consequence of the long-term effects of slavery and the atrocities in its aftermath. And so that's why we settle on the racial wealth gap as the primary indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy on folks who are living now. And so we choose the second approach, which is to find this single measure that attempts to capture the combined effects of all of these harms. And so when we settle on the racial wealth gap as the core mechanism for measuring the size of the reparations bill, we come up with a figure in the present moment of about $14 trillion that is owed to the 40 million individuals whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States and who are living as Black Americans today.
And only the American government could do $14 trillion. I mean, probably not in a single year. I mean, I imagine this would have to be over time.
It could.
It could do it in a single year.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And we recommend, though, that it be done over no more than a decade. Yeah. No more than that. Certainly not 50 years, as some people are proposing with the California measure. And we also say that if, a legitimate concern might be the adverse inflationary effects of such an injection of funds into the economy. You could distribute the funds in ways that are different from simple direct cash transfers. You could distribute the funds that took in a form in which they were less liquid assets.
It could be annuities, a trust fund,
some type of
some
endowment,
portfolio of assets. Yeah.
But the key thing is that the individual recipients should ultimately have full discretion over the use of the funds.
They should get the funds. People should individually.
They should get the money. Yeah. It should not be channeled through some social program or some third party.
Or be converted to scholarships, for example.
The scholarships.
Why not?
Everyone.
Yeah. Why?
Well, so everyone is not, looking to go to college or back to college, or may or may not have relatives who they could, give that money to, if that was even allowed. This was not, when Japanese Americans received those uniform payments of $20,000, they didn't come with a caveat that said, okay, you can only use this money if you're going to, go to a state school, or you can only use this money if you're buying a house.
And it wasn't put through social programs. Yeah, and it wasn't put through social programs.
No, it was given directly to them.
Yeah.
And
as it should have been.
As it should have been.
Yeah.
And that work was done in about 18 months.
Yeah.
Beginning to end.
It was $10,000 each person?
$20,000.
$20,000. 1988.
And $1988, which is about $43,000 or so today. Something like that, $38,000 to $43,000, depending on which calculator you use. And people say, $20,000, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but many of these families were farmers, and they had larger families. So say you had 4 children, that's a family of 6. You're talking in today's dollars, something closer to $240,000 to $320,000, $25,000. That's not insignificant for, individuals who were incarcerated for 4 years. 4 years. I'm not belittling the horrors that they were subjected to, but people who say, well, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, need to really think about, the conversion to today's currency.
Kirsten Mullen and William A. Darity Jr. have been our guests. They've joined us for a conversation about reparations. They are the editors and contributors of a new book. It's called The Black Reparations Project, a Handbook for Racial Justice. William Darity, Kirsten Mullen, I've enjoyed that conversation very much. It was very educational, and I thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks very much.